Well, we are in Exodus chapter 20, continuing on today. We've indicated this is really the centerpiece of the book of Exodus. Everything that's gone on before has been pretty much leading up to this moment. And really the rest of Exodus, in some ways, is the aftermath and unpacking of the significance of the things that are actually happening here. So the Ten Commandments represent that great, wonderful moment when God entrusts his wisdom to humanity. And of course it was given, at least we were saying the last time, not for Israel's sake, but for giving it to Israel for the world's sake. To them that was entrusted, the oracles of God was not their private possession, but it would become the source of illumination for the world. And indeed, it has been throughout history. So anyways, the first commandment, of course, was the prohibition against having any of their gods in God's presence. No other objects of worship are tolerated. And that's for our own good. It's not the only way it ought to be in terms of reality of things, but it's the way it ought to be for the purposes of our own integrity. Our own well-being requires that we have one thing that we place our entire loyalty to, and everything else then takes its proper place or falls into place. No man can serve two masters. We fragment when we actually try to do that. And the first commandment is this great psychological remedy about 1,000 problems that we have. Isn't it just to put the right thing in the right place? And so that's the first commandment. The second commandment says we can't reduce this God. We worship to something that is contained materially, that is in the medical, physical reality of God cannot be poured into, for example, concrete, mortar, wood in this world. Heaven and earth cannot contain him, much less the artifacts that we can actually produce. And so we can insult this divine majesty by trying to put him into some little creation or statue of our own design. The third commandment, of course, is the command that we respect how we speak of this great being. This is the whole, this is the one whose awe should be reflected in a way that we refer to him. And so we are prohibited against using his name in a thoughtless way, in a vain way, a mindless way. But we should always give it gravity, in a sense, in the way that we refer to him with reverence. And then, of course, that brings us to the fourth commandment. And this is verse 8 of Exodus chapter 20. And we'll just take a little bit of time and nibble away at that one. So let's read this paragraph, and then we'll work our way through. Verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath day to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien who is in your towns. For 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. So that's our initial text for today, and let's ask God's blessing of our consideration of it. Father in heaven, indeed we are deeply grateful to you for the rich and lavish mercy that you pour out upon us each and every day, week by week. And we thank you for the opportunities that we have to sit and reflect on the riches of the truth that you've given to us contained in your word. We ourselves grope in darkness, however, without your Spirit. And we so invoke at this time, in the name of Christ, the Holy Spirit, which can open our eyes and expose our hearts, not only to hear and understand, but to believe and embrace and indeed live by these wonderful principles of life that you've given to us here. We give thanks to you in all this in your precious name, Jesus. Amen. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, we've talked about the Sabbath before, of course, and I don't want to spend too much time revisiting things that we've probably discussed in the past. But of all the 10 Commandments, I think you know, this one has been the subject of greatest apparent revision in terms of how we see this from a New Testament point of view. If we look at all 10 Commandments, they are given to us in the 10 Commandments. All of them are repeated, re-emphasized, reinforced, verbatim, in the New Testament, with the exception of this particular one. This one, that we never hear, simply restated, as it were, to announce that the people of God as a rule for their lives. And it caused the church historically to consider at least the possibility there's some kind of re-engineering of this particular commandment. Not that it goes away, but it just takes on a different form. It looks a little different. And we get to the New Covenant era. There have been dissenters to that, of course, and I'm sure you all are aware of that. And we might say in church history, there have been extremes. We've got kind of the mainstream Christian understanding, which is the church has been the main focus down through history on the one hand, and we have a minority group that says we're supposed to observe this commandment on its original terms, and indeed this continues to be obligatory for Christian people, and that, of course, the Main Street Church and our observance on Sunday is an error. For you and I worshiping and gathering on Sunday, we should have been here on Saturday, and we are in fact then disregarding what God eventually made, this rule for us in the New Testament. And we only have 9 commandments, and that the commandment with respect to the Sabbath has completely gone away, and Christians are utterly at liberty to this point, to fully disregard it. And, having said that, the church has never been real comfortable with either of those two extremes. We have, on the one hand, believe that there is some sense in which the Sabbath command has continuity. And yet, so we think in that continuity, it looks a little different with the advent of the work of Jesus Christ in the New Testament era. We find evidence for that in the life of Jesus himself. Jesus seems to go out of his way to, pick fights or with the religious establishment on the Sabbath issue particularly. It's amazing how much the New Testament gospel accounts deal with these Sabbath controversies. How many of these controversies relate to Jesus doing something that seems to challenge in that day the status quo with respect on how they actually understand the Sabbath? And it's pretty evident throughout the gospel accounts. Not that Jesus is simply throwing out the Sabbath. I don't think that's it at all. But we really see here there's a little bit of a different emphasis on what's going on. Jesus, for example, instead of following and accepting the rule of resting on the Sabbath, seems to be the one who works on the Sabbath, but calls it holy labor on the Sabbath. It's a little bit different than just sitting around kicking your feet up on the couch. So it's not ordinary labor, for example, running down to the office to work on Sunday and billing a couple hours for that after church on Sunday. It's nothing like that. But there is, in a sense, in which it seems that Jesus is recreating the Sabbath as a holy day of labor rather than a holy day of rest. And a great deal of what we see in those Sabbath controversy items seems to be pointing us in that direction. But Jesus never expressly says anything about Saturday Sabbath and being no longer applicable or anything like that as well. That never happens. Then we look at the rest of the New Testament and we will find the reference actually to the Sabbath is fully absent from the remainder of the New Testament. Nothing in Paul would reinforce it. In other words, there's no instruction. Here's how you should behave on the Sabbath day or something. There's nothing in Peter like that. And the rest of the New Testament, it seems to simply drop off the radar screen. Now, that is an argument from silence that doesn't prove anything either way. But it's interesting, and while the other commandments are restated with some vigor, this one just seems to disappear from the interest in the New Testament. And indeed, if anything, we find in the New Testament it's a little bit negative attitude towards the way in which they actually celebrated it. Paul, for example, in Romans 14, warns against the people who become overly concerned about observing certain days, times and seasons and so on. Colossians chapter 2 expressly warns against rigorous Sabbath keeping mentality that happened there. Something like that in Galatians as well we see. And so we find the Sabbath at least seems to be getting a little bit of a different tilt in the New Testament compared to the Old Testament. The book of Hebrews seems to take a different view on the Sabbath as well. And it says quite a bit about it, but it's obviously not quite the same as the Old Testament view. And so that's led Christians out of this kind of middle place of understanding. There seems to be something that's there, doesn't quite look like the Old Testament rule, and for that reason, we find in the history of the church a fair amount of latitude among various Christian groups and communities down through history. And you'll find some that tend to lean towards a more rigorous kind of concern about observing the holy day, which is usually Sunday. And then there's a little bit more relaxing on all the points in between. And it does seem to me that there is a kind of freedom that's given to the church with respect to how it's going to work out in history. Now, believe me, I'm not being dogmatic on this. I'm just saying and looking at this from a point of view from history. And it seems that we have kind of fluidity about the question of the Sabbath. All right. Having said all that, what I'd like to do, however, is come back to this particular paragraph and look at it, in a little bit more detail in its historical setting, even though we are at least taking the view that we're not specifically and strictly bound to it in the way that it may have been bound in the Old Testament. I think it's still instructive to hear something about what it says. So let's go back to the text. So it says, "Remember the Sabbath day. Keep it holy. Keep it set apart." It's part of the holiness code of the Old Testament. God's people are commanded to be holy, for God is holy. And the holiness idea of with respect to the people of God was in a sense in which how they would become different and separated. They would be distinguished from other nations of the world precisely because, number one, as we've discussed in the past, they were a priestly nation. And priestly types are supposed to live by a somewhat higher standard than everybody else. They're supposed to distinguish themselves by virtue of the code that they live by. And we find that it becomes a very obligatory thing with respect to the people of Israel. So there's their kosher laws, their regulations about what's clean and unclean, a variety of regulations that govern the life of the average Israelite. These things didn't apply to the Hittites, they didn't apply to the Egyptians. Even if they worshipped the one true God, they weren't expected to keep the kosher laws. It seems that maybe a reference to the Sabbath has something to do with what's going on here, although that could be debated. I'm certainly not taking a position on it, but it seems to be at least part of the holiness code of the people of God, the people of Israel. Then this instructions: 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. It's often missed that this commandment has two imperatives, doesn't it? A commandment to rest and a commandment to work. The Old Testament rule with respect to the people of God was that they should work. That's the command, as much as it is the command to rest, In other words, there is a place in the life of God's people to work. For ordinary work of self-sustaining labor and so on. And while it may seem a little obvious and not too important, when you take this rule and look at it in the light of the context of the ancient world, for example, certainly in 1500 BC, which of course is in round numbers when it was announced, and even much later, this is really virtually unique. That work is given such dignity. Now, for example, when you look at Aristotle, who's regarded as one of the great enlightened philosophers and spirits, of course, of the ancient world. And of course, he's writing in the 400 BC era. So it's a good 1,000 years after that. And even then, the ancient world still regarded work as kind of a degrading thing. Only the people who should work are, for example, the lower classes, the slaves, those who are unworthy of this kind of elevated caste, virtually. Work isn't for the special people, the right people, the superior people. Work is for the people who are, in a sense, inferior. And you look at that, and you see that in Egypt. You see that virtually in every ancient civilization except one. And among the ancient Israelites, work was not only taken as a status of being taken out of the status of being degrading, it was actually placed in a status of being an elevated thing. Something that gives dignity. Something that contributes to a human sense of worth. The book of Proverbs, of course, is replete with this idea, but you also find it elsewhere as well. That work is something that actually dignifies the human spirit, and that's a novelty in the ancient world. And I think that in itself almost suggests to us this must be taken and having divine origins, because who would have dreamed that up? That we should work, and that work is actually good for us. And if you survey Western philosophy, really, there's not a lot of attention to work until one particular philosopher, and of course he was a very influential philosopher of Western thought, and he finally takes that work and makes it the centerpiece of his particular philosophy and builds everything around the notion of labor. Does anyone know who that is? Now, this may surprise you, but that individual was Karl Marx. Now, I'm going to stress right now, I am not a Marxist. I think probably you suspect that. I'm not here to give any great praise to Marx, but you do have to give credit where credit is due. And at least on this particular point, Karl Marx made a great contribution to Western society. Now, I don't think he gave it sufficient credit to that. He should have. I mean, for example, he was Jewish and he grew up in a Jewish home. He repudiated all that, of course, and became a flaming atheist, which is another unpinning of his entire philosophy. But I don't think his diatribe against the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, for example, in the sweatshops, its factories, black smoke, its child labor, it's really a grotesque side of the transformation that happened in Western civilization. I think his diatribe against that what was driven by his familiarity that he had with the Old Testament from when he was growing up. He knew it. He knew the Bible, especially the Old Testament, and he sounds a lot, for example, like Amos, who also criticizes the opportunistic kinds of forces that were affecting life at those times, for example, when Amos was alive. Now, Marx sounds a little bit like an Old Testament prophet. He doesn't give good answers, in my opinion, to the problem, but I think his analysis of the problem is pretty close to the mark, and probably, at least on this particular point, he's worthy of a little bit of recognition. Even on the part of those of us who may not have some great affection for him or otherwise. But here we find, way before Marx, 1500 BC, before he wrote his philosophy, the Old Testament had already discovered how important work was. And of course, the importance of labor, just as this text implies itself, goes right back to creation. We were created to labor. We are a laboring species, and that was part of the original situation before the fall. I've heard these people say no because, there's too much, you're too much enlightened for this, but I've heard it say that all labor came by God as part of God's punishment, and that's not the case at all. No. We were created to labor. We were given the garden, for example, to till it. That's what we were told to do. That's what Adam was told to do, to care for it, to expand it. And we were given a dominion mandate of all that took place before the fall ever entered the picture. The quality of labor changed, of course, to the sweat of the brow of thorns, and all that changed after the fall. but we should labor, and that labor should be central to our understanding of actually who we are, was before sin ever entered the picture. So if you want to go back to Genesis and take a look at that, it's really enlightening. So 6 days you'll labor and do your work. But verse 10, the seventh day is a Sabbath day to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. Meaning any regular work. There's obviously an allowance in the Old Testament for all kinds of work on the Sabbath, necessary labor. For example, the labor of the priests and so on. But none of your regular work day was supposed to be happening. You shall not work, you, your son, your daughter. And so it extends this implication here that you would be, of course, at least the head of the household in a patriarchal world that it was back then. And it would be the husband, the father, and then it extends to the family. And then unexpectedly, it even goes further than that. Your male and female slaves. Slavery was universal back then, as you know, in the ancient world. But there's a very non-universal rule that is brought forward into focus here. Even the slaves here are given a day off. This is the first labor law. We talk about our labor standards today. This is the first one, and it's in the Bible. Mark didn't come up with that. And so even the slaves would not find anything like this, not even remotely like this, in cultures like Egyptian, Assyrian, Mesopotamian, Greek. It's just not there. But now even the slaves, even those people who are regarded as property, are given a day off. That's a very dignifying component, don't you think? Its impact is sort of recognition that these people are also human, unlike the surrounding nations, which, viewed them essentially as chattel. No, they were to be given the same kind of treatment. Your male and female slaves. And then it goes on and says your livestock. So here, PETA should be happy with this. I've never heard a word from PETA. Give credit where credit is due on this one. The first animal rights legislation, if you will. I hate that expression, but I guess it says something about me. But anyways, the whole notion of caring for the livestock, your beasts, is a concern to ancient Israel. A righteous man has regard for the life of his beast. Solomon tells us that, and also otherwise. So just watch the story of how animals are treated in the Old Testament, throughout the Old Testament, and you'll see a little bit of that. I don't want to overstate this point, but at least there's some sort of subtlety that's happening here on some level. But here's a day off that is extended even to the animals as part of our world. And then finally, your alien resident within your towns. I mentioned this before, but I'm going to say it again. I don't intend any political comment whatsoever in terms of contemporary debates about borders or immigration or anything like that today. I'm simply saying as a matter of historical fact. And I'm not saying this becomes a paradigm for what policy we should be doing today. I'm not referring to that at all. I'm just saying, as a matter of historical fact, Israel had an open borders policy. You could move to Israel and you could live there. There were no border guards, nothing like that. It was permissible, and people did it. And we see plenty of evidence of that. The caveat to this is that you could move to Israel, live there, but you could not create a subculture in Israel by which you imported the culture of your previous living situation. We've all heard of that, and for example, Little Italy, right? The idea of Chinatown. We understand in our modern terms what that means. It means you can go to a place of sort with a polite sense of the word, and I hate to use this, but I'm going to use it anyways, like a ghetto, and you feel like you've almost gone back to the mother country of that origin. Israel, for example, never permitted to have little Babylon, little Egypt, a little enclave by which the practices and beliefs and value systems and the worship, etc., of the prior community was allowed to infiltrate itself. So just looking at that, you could move to Israel, no questions asked, move right in, settle down. But you were expected to conform to the culture, the worship, the standards, the values, and the ethics of Israel. So you're going to observe the Sabbath. You're not going to have household gods. Now, obviously, this rule wasn't always enforced very consistently, But nonetheless, that was the rule. Open borders, but not open culture. Not open values. And so this is one of the many, many evidence of the principle that runs through the Old Testament. So the resident alien who lives in your town is also going to abide by this rule. Then the reference back to creation. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Now it's been noted that by many commentators, that the entire Ten Commandments is rooted in creation. And I'm going to highlight that as we go here. This one certainly expressly is tied to creation. There is an idea, I think you can say, that the Ten Commandments is intended, as we live by its guidance, to recreate for us almost like a little taste of Eden. That as we live by this rule, we experience, at least in a modest degree, a little feel for Eden. The very fact that there's rest is supposed to remind us, in a sense, of God's rest. And that should be that we ourselves should have rejuvenation, as it were. And that's connected directly to this. And the Lord so creates, and the Lord rests. And then we have creation. We labor. Labor produces wealth. The Bible said that before, well before Adam Smith said what is productivity to labor creates wealth, God created for 6 days, and then we have a result, which is wealth. We labor, and it's a product of wealth. And then we rest. There's kind of a dignity about the rhythm that we see here that refers back to being created in the image of God, and that we are reproducing, in a sense, in our own lives, something of God's own great work. It's almost like a mere reflection of it. What's interesting, and I'll just make a little footnote here, is this reference to the Sabbath in the creation account is very important. Chapter 2 begins with it, and then the Sabbath is never really mentioned again in all the book of Genesis. We never hear of it in the life of Abraham. We never hear of it in the life of Isaac and Jacob, who were the patriarchs. It's fully absent. We don't know if they did it. Maybe they had some sort of idea about that, but it's not recorded. And the fact that it's not recorded is what's actually important. It makes the argument, at least from some scholars, would say it continues to make the argument that the Sabbath was intended especially as a sign of this particular covenant with Moses, and not through Abraham. Abraham was given circumcision. He was not given the Sabbath, in other words. But with Moses, we now have this incorporation of the Sabbath. And the argument would be that it just as it came with Moses, so it is to be at least revisited substantially with Christ, who brings us a new covenant that displaces the covenant with Moses, but does not displace the covenant with Abraham. Christ is the seed of Abraham. He is the realization of all that was promised to Abraham. Much of what's given to us in Moses is the sacrificial system and so on, set aside with Christ. That would be, at least in one way, one argument that's offered anyways. And I'm not saying this definitively, but nevertheless, it's interesting. So that's number 4. Now, let's come to what's called the second table. The second table is the last 6 commandments that begins with this, and it's usually regarded as a transitional commandment. And that is, honor your father and mother, so that your days may be long in the land of the Lord, your God, is giving to you. It's viewed as transitional because there is, in a sense, we move then from our vertical obligations to horizontal obligations. This is the one that kind of marks this transition. As I honor my father and mother, I'm also honoring those who have authority by virtue of the fact that God has given them authority. When a child honors his parents, there is, in a sense, in which through his parents that is, he is honoring God. That God has entrusted his parents to something of God's own dignity, God's own glory. And the child sees that, first of all, in the parents, and learns that through them, to honor them, or honor the parent, is what lies behind all of us. The parents also stand, in a sense, for the first authority the child ever deals with. And so by extension of this, we could say that this commandment is not only referring to parents, but it implies and is referring to all other authorities that God has given to us, which is, for example, governmental authority and all. Whatever authorities may be out there, we eventually need to learn to respect. A child that learns to respect his or her parent will have a much easier time respecting, for example, the police officer. And that is to be given if a child learns to be disrespectful to a parent, then they will be disrespectful to other authorities. And so this is kind of a first opportunity we learn respect for authorities in this world, understanding that those actually came by God's gift. For example, Paul says that in Romans 13, the authorities that exist are from God. And as I honor those authorities, I'm honoring God. That's kind of a given. I think you all know that through the scriptures. And here it is. The authorities in this world have been called, and I believe it was Calvin that first coined this term, but common grace. The idea that, we, even if we're not Christian believers, nevertheless, we live in the benefit of grace that God has given. And that we are to be provided with gracious provisions that God has made for us, which is actually for the good of humanity. People may not properly worship the God who gave those gifts, but they still have the benefit of them. God, since in his reign to be just, stands, and then there's the unjust, the notion of kind of having a common blessing that God gives. And one of those expressions of common grace is these government authorities. And I think that's kind of obvious enough. Why, you may ask? Well, if all those authorities disappear, we are plunged into what technically is referred to the absence of authority or no authority. And I think we can see that in today's Western world and the problems that it's causing. So the common word that we use for this is anarchy. No rule, no king, and so on and so forth. There's no rule. Most people have been aware anywhere near something like that. If you ever have, it's a dreadful circumstance, as you can imagine. As a rule, people will take, for example, iron-fisted totalitarianism any day over anarchy. Where I live in constant fear of my neighborhood being intruded, exploited, invaded, where it doesn't matter and the biggest stick always wins the fight. And I think most rational people don't like that. It's not a fun way to live. Most of us prefer an ordered, structured stability to human society, where I have these certain sense where I can get on the freeway, drive down it. I'm not going to have people coming up on me on the wrong side of the road, pelting rocks at me just for driving down a freeway. And that's going to be a bit of predictability that we have about life, and at least in some substantial measure of the way that the reason that happens to have that structure is because God ordained these authorities to protect the human order. And that's why our days will be long. Anarchy. It always translates into usually short lives. You don't live very long when there is no order. It's hard to get life insurance in an anarchic society. Why? Because the risks are too high. But as I honor my mother and father and beyond them, honor, of course, the institution of authority that God has given us, it creates longevity, which is only possible under those circumstances. The Bible otherwise, though, has a lot of interest in the father and mother. Now, some parents are better than others. We're not going to question that. My parents were wonderful. I'm grateful to the rich gift that God gave me, both my beloved mom and dad. Not everybody has such wonderful experiences with their parents, but that is, in spite of the character of the parent, nevertheless a requirement to honor the office And to somehow see, and sometimes by contrast, even a negative example, to see that in something of good that God has actually given to us. And I think it's essential to keeping this. That again, not necessarily true of every culture in the ancient world, but there were some examples that were better than others. Some would practice a dreadful kind of ethnic saying, well, once a person got to a certain age, then they would just sort of, leave them under a tree or something, and you're kind of on your own, and as the expression is used, expose them to the world. The first expression of euthanasia in the ancient world. They've outlived their usefulness. And there are a lot of places in the world where this is still practiced today. Happily, not many places, but it is. So, you have the end of life, the beginning of life. And that's how you measure a culture. That's how you measure the sophistication of a culture. Not every culture in the ancient world was quite as ruthless as some of those. Some, to their credit, had great respect for their elders. And so I cannot say to you that this is uniquely a Jewish rule, but it certainly isn't the case that many did not have a kind of reverence both for the end of life and the beginning of life. Infanticide was quite common in the ancient world. Abortion was quite common in the ancient world. In my opinion, you can gauge the sophistication of a culture by looking at these two ends of this particular spectrum. The weak, the helpless, those who need more help than they can give. And what does a culture do with them? When we evaluate that, in a sense, this commandment stands for that great recognition of the actual value of life, regardless of whether the life is doing anything much at that particular moment. So I have this great rule, and without carrying on, I'll just leave it at that. So let's go on to the next one. You shall not murder. All right, this is an interpretation, not a translation. But the Hebrew word here simply means kill. It's a much broader word. It doesn't mean illegitimate killing. It just means killing. It's a word that would apply with equal legitimacy to a human being or to a grasshopper. Thou shalt not kill. Now, I'm not making this case, so don't get nervous. I'm not going to go where you think I may be going, and I'll just put it this way. For example, radical pacifism. Let's put it in the way of the Old Testament. You certainly find in the casuary of the Old Testament plenty of allowance for capital punishment, plenty of allowance for the need for war, and so on and so forth. And we have to take that at face value. But what I'm saying here is simply this. The word itself stands for, in a deep sense, the actual value of life. It's a great affirmation of the worth of life and takes us also back to the Garden of Eden. Every one of these takes us back to Eden. Life comes with an Adamic situation by the breath of God. You see, life is simply not a coincidence. It's not a chemical reaction. One of the great ironies, I think, of the 20th century is, for example, Francis Crick, who's the character, Thomas and Crick. These were two guys that figured out the double helix of DNA and all of that. Now, Crick was the one who said he went into this area of biology because he wanted to, quote, exorcise the demon of vitalism from biology. He was an atheist, of course, to his dying day, and he probably gave more horsepower to the argument of intelligent design movement than any other single person. Because the deeper he dug into the human cell, the more complexity he found. And it becomes so complex, it's absolutely mind-boggling. And even today, the complexity of DNA and RNA and all that stuff is so complex today. You see what's going on here? The information age is what's happening deep inside the human cell, long before it was ever dreamed up by, for example, IBM or Apple or Microsoft or whatever. This has been one of the true greatest reversals of the attempt to exorcise the demon of vitalism. It caused many people to think that there's no other way that we can account for this remarkable phenomenon than to explain that some divine explanation for it. You have to have a divine being. It smacks of heaven, for example, that we have life, and then we look at the world around us, and we see green trees, we see the wildlife, we see animals, and the world just seems to be so impressively alive around us. And while we may sometimes take this for granted, just not even have a casual thought about it, especially when we look at something as barren as the moon or Mars. To our knowledge, any of these planets out there are just, and scientists today are desperately trying to find any little hope of some minuscule evidence of life on those planets, and nothing has shown up to this point. I'm not sure it ever will, but there here is on this planet Earth just an overflowing evidence of it. And what is that? That's God. Every time we see a green tree, we're seeing a little bit of God. Now, don't misinterpret this. I'm not a pantheist, and God is not everything. I want you to understand that. But there is, in a sense, evidence all around us that the God in every breath we take is the one who created us. You know the name Albert Schweitzer? He was a highly respected New Testament scholar who was seized in his conscience with the plight of the medical condition of the folks of Africa. After that, having made a name for himself as a young man, as a New Testament scholar, now he was fairly liberal, and I don't agree with a lot of what he was arguing for, but he was a fairly good scholar. Nevertheless, he went back to medical school, and then he went off for 40 years in a fairly obscure outpost in Africa, serving as a medical missionary. And though he was serving in a relative obscurity at that point, he became a world-famous name because of it. I don't think he attended that. He eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize for all those years of selfless service, which he loved and he devoted himself to by serving those who could neither pay for or repay him, or at least certainly couldn't repay him adequately, for his expertise and treatments throughout the years. When he was interviewed, as often as he was, as to why he was there and what it was all about, he reduced his ethic to one little phrase. 3 words he published on this, and it became more or less the motto for his life. And those 3 words were a reverence for life. That was it. He was deeply committed to that idea. I'm suggesting to you here that in a sense we should look with wonder at life all around us, and thus killing in any form should always give pause to us. Now, the Old Testament times knows that there is a time to kill. As Solomon says, for example, there is just war, there is capital offense. Even capital offense in the Old Testament is sanctioned. However, it's based upon the value of life. You look at Genesis 9 and 6, where capital punishment is instituted under the Noahic covenant, and it's called, as it's called. And that's the verse that said, if a man sheds blood, then by man his blood shall be shed, or will be shed. That's the institution of capital punishment. Then the rationale is given in these words, because in the image of God he was created. And the reference back to our dignity as created beings in the image of God. So if I assault you, the one who bears God's image, then I'm doing something just right next to basically assaulting God. If the President of the United States, for example, is attacked, and we don't view that as an attack on one man, we view it as an attack on a whole nation, don't we? What he stands for. That which the images they carry, in a sense, when somebody attacks a human being, they're attacking God, the image bearer. And that's such a colossal crime, and it warrants the forfeiture of life of the person who is being attacked. That's the biblical kind of justification for it. So we see here, even in capital punishment, is related in some way to the value, the dignity, and the worth of human life. So anyways, the rule is that we should be life givers, not life takers. And I think the practical application for us as at least Christian people is that every day we should pray as part of the beginning of our day. Father, help me as I go this day to give life to the people I meet. And I think you know that. You know, there's some people out there you meet and they're just like a big black hole. They just suck the life right out of you. Have you ever noticed that? Have you had that feeling before? And then some people you meet, and for all the world you walk away, and 5 minutes later you feel the most alive you've ever been. You know, they gave you life. They imputed life to you. We have that ability to minister grace. Paul says, don't let destructive communication proceed out of your mouth, but only such as good for edifying, that you may give grace to the person who heard you. Just by the words we speak, for example, we can be a means of grace. Did you know you can be a means of grace to every person you meet and give them life? You can leave them feeling more alive than before when you found them. That's the way Christians can take this command and kind of make it part of our every single day life. All right, so enough about that. But it's true, you know, we really can impact individuals all around us every single day. So let's look at the next commandment. You shouldn't commit adultery. Not much to say on this one. It's pretty self-explanatory. What is this? It also takes us back to Eden as well. Now, there's one institution of humanity that was ordained for human good that happened before the fall. And as we hear at every wedding in the time of man's innocence, you know, most human institutions are in kind of a remedial sense. They're fixing something that was broken. Human government, for example, is fixing something that was broken. Even the church is remedial. Something's broken and we need that great ministry of grace and redemption. The one institution that was given to humankind before we were broken was the institution of marriage. God didn't look at the universe and say, oh no, it's bad, I need to fix it, therefore I give marriage. No, he looked at the universe and said, it is good. Now I'm going to make it better. I'm going to make it very good. And so he just gives us the first human community, the first human society. And he says, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. The Hebrew says they will become one organism. The two became one. We're living, as you know, at a time where the institution of marriage is embattled, to say the least. Even in today's churches, it's embattled. And I think it's a great case that we have against it. Alternative approaches to marriage and to the sexual aspect of life. The best case to be made, of course, is biblically, which is not prohibitive, though it is certainly there. There are no thou shalt nots in the Bible with respect to the variety of sexual practices that are not considered to be right or good or obedient to God. But the most formidable case, is the affirmative case for marriage. That biblically stands at the core and the heart of the beginning of health for human beings. Even if you're not married, it is still something that you can live in the benefits of day in and day out. It's been sad and used to be taught constantly. I don't hear it so much anymore. And standard education in the family is the building blocks of society. You know, have you ever heard of that? Isn't it true? And when you begin to see society that attacks the family unit, you know, that trajectory of that society cannot be good. And that is kind of the unraveling that will necessarily occur as a result of that. It's been discovered and noted countless times throughout history. These people who've tried to find a different model that's otherwise given to us. For example, Plato came up with that idea, and is the republic as light as he? Let's have a common children. You know, he said, let's have common children. Well, you know, the community raises the children. Everybody cares for everybody. He's the first guy who said that it takes a village. Let's just have everybody take care of everybody's kids and his republic. And how well did that work out? Well, we know historically it didn't work out very well. And Aristotle, the first guy to criticize his master for that particular absurdity. Who's going to take care of the kids if not their parents? Who else wants the kids except the parents? Aristotle figured that one out right away. We need the family and this command. Well, though stated negatively, is really a standard for the great affirmative of the beginning of a human society that becomes the substructure and the underpinnings of all human society. Okay, next one. You shall not steal. This goes back to creation, as we were saying earlier. We're put in the garden to labor, and just as God's labor would produce wealth, so our labor produces wealth. That's the connection here biblically. It's a principle restated countless times. Diligent hands make rich. It's the idea that labor produces wealth. At the time Adam Smith wrote, there was a prevailing economic theory called mercantilism, and it proceeded on the assumption that there's a fixed amount of wealth in the world. So there's a certain value. And the task of nations was to try and get as much of that slice of the pie as we could. And that's basically the business model today. How much is your market share? I deal with that every single day in my job. Hence, you had to be exploitive, conquest, go out and get somebody else's gold, so on and so forth. And it was like there was only a certain amount that was to go around. And whoever has the most of that wins. And Adam Smith made and he created he credited actually the Bible for this wisdom. There's not a fixed amount of wealth in the world. The amount of wealth varies depending on the productive labor that's being performed by that particular society. Where does the wealth of the nations come from? It comes from productive labor. That's how you get rich, and by being productive in your day-to-day labor. God was productive in his labor, and he put humans in the garden to till and take care of it, to have dominion over it, to expand its borders day by day, and create the net wealth, as it were, in the world by modeling what God himself had done. Now, when I invade, for example, your legitimate wealth and take it from you, I've not simply done something that is illegal. I've done something that is absolutely anti-holy. I violated a sacred trust. And many of you felt and have possibly felt this experience. Have you ever had something taken from you? I have. I haven't had the experience very often in my life, but when it has happened, it stuck with me. Even if it's someone going into your car, which you accidentally left open and took your coffee change out of the coffee cup holder. That sort of stuff sticks with me. And, I've also had a vehicle stolen on me before and wrecked in an accident because of that theft. So those things stick with me. And I'm sure each and every one of you had an experience of someone has taken something that didn't belong to them and they took it from you. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here, and there is some theological content in that God created us such as that we labor, do what God did or model what God did himself, and we acquire legitimately that which he's entrusted to us, and it's a natural consequence of our labor. And so there's kind of a sacred connection there. Doesn't justify greed. I'm not supposed to use this for total gain, but I am also supposed to produce charity as a result of it. I'm supposed to give it freely. I'm not supposed to be overly acquisitive with it. But I can't even get, but if I can't even give at the offering, I cannot give a gift unless there's a notion of property that I own, or I have gained wealth unless there's a notion of proper ownership of that. There's nothing I have to give away. And if we go back to that, this is the absolutely where Marx totally missed the mark. He thought, well, if we get rid of private property, we'll solve the world's problems. And every time it has been attempted, as you know, it has been a colossal failure because you destroy the human spirit. When my labor doesn't somehow translate into something, a trust, then the whole incentive for labor is undercut. Stalin seen it, he discovered it, Lenin discovered it, the whole Soviet Empire discovered it as people lived in radical poverty because the human spirit was absolutely being destroyed. We're seeing that still continue around the world today in places like Venezuela, and we're seeing the notion and the idea of this same type of model trying to invade our Western culture today. And if they are successful, it is not going to be good for us. It's been discovered many other times. I don't need to tell you the story of that. Okay, without getting political here, and I don't want to get off into that, but you can see the examples of this. The last two, thou shalt not bear false witness. This goes back to creation and speech. God gave humanity the capacity and the responsibility to speak truth, to engage, to put words to things that would correspond to the reality of things. That's what words are supposed to do. And when I start using words so that the words correspond to that, which are not real, that which is fictitious or false, then I have violated sacred trust of my words. And so we should, as Paul says, it's so wonderfully in the New Testament put, speak the truth in love. If we just speak the truth, that could be highly destructive. If you just speak the truth every time it occurs to you, well, that was an experiment I remember from school, and let's just be honest. There has been some damage been done, and I think we can all testify to this, in the name of honesty. I hate to think about it. No, speak the truth. We have to speak the truth. But we need to speak the truth in love. And we see Jesus was a perfect example of this. If it's just love and no truth, sweet little lies, that's no better either. But when we speak the truth in love, as Jesus did, you never had a conversation with a man, but what you heard was truth, God's truth. But it was always from the heart that was perfectly concerned about the well-being of that individual. Even when Jesus spoke to the Pharisees and said, for example, you bunch of snakes, well, that was true. It was a correct metaphor. But even then, he was saying it receptively. There was an opportunity presented to them to change and repent. And finally, thou shalt not, the last commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Your neighbor's wife is male or female, slave, ox, donkey, anything that belongs to your neighbor, to set my affections on that, which is not mine and could not never legitimately be mine. And this is not a prohibition against going to the store and buying a toy that you want. That's okay, that's fine, because it can be legitimately yours. As long as you're not being irresponsible otherwise with your wealth, it's fine. But when I set my affections on another man's wife or on something that I cannot legitimately own or have, Paul calls that idolatry. And it's so interesting, isn't it, that the Ten Commandments begins with idolatry and ends with idolatry. And the Ten Commandments ends with the root of the violation of every other command. When I steal from my neighbor, when I lust for what is my neighbor's, when I lie to my neighbor, when I kill my neighbor, when I don't honor my father, among all the things we are prohibited here, begin with this illegitimate fixation on what is not rightfully, nor ever could be rightfully mine. Coveting things. In the final analysis, is my overt expression, for example, of discontent of what God has given to me and made me responsible for. Paul says For example, I've learned, to whatever state I am there, to be with content. And we have all good reason to be content. And there's a wonderful sweet spiritedness about a content person, regardless of their status or stature that they have. When I look across the fence and say, well, that guy, I wish I had what he has, then essentially what we're saying to God, you didn't do much for me, did you, God? This world you created for me is not all that great. I don't like it so much. You really gave me a raw deal here, God, because I want that. That's really what I want. And that's the deepest kind of hostility and ungratefulness that we can have. To set my heart on something that God has not given to us. But please, God, give it to me. He knew it wouldn't be good for me. And I've got to have it. I really got to have it. It doesn't matter what God thinks. That's idolatry. And so the Ten Commandments starts and ends with that great principle. Well, that's it for today. I know it's probably been a little bit long. And I'm going to be taking a little bit of a break here. But we've completed the parallel to our Sunday morning classes, sermons from Exodus 1 to chapter 20. And I'd just like to close in a brief word of prayer. And thank you for listening. Father, we're thankful to you today for these provisions and insights that you've given to us today, Lord. And I pray that you would open our hearts and minds, Lord, to make these more relevant to us day by day, and that you would bring these back to our memories so that we can continue to daily honor you and give you the honor and glory that you deserve because of the grace and mercy that you provided to us. We pray, Lord, that you would keep these things in our hearts and minds. And we are so thankful for the word and the freedoms that we have today, Lord. Even though there's many problems in the world today, even in our own countries, Lord, we still pray and know that you are divine and you are ruler over all, and that you are always in complete control. We can't see the end result, Lord, but you know the end result. Help us to be faithful to you daily, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.